Hello everyone, it's King's Comments, and today we're going to be talking about the ongoings in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and clearly there's been a lot of new developments that have taken place since my last video. And I had mentioned in my last video that any hope of Ukraine having an opportunity to actually save face or win this war was completely gone. And now, since the Russian offensive that's taken place in the Kharkiv region, any thoughts or ideas that the manpower situation is going to get better for Ukraine is only going to get much, much worse as the casualty counts on a day-to-day basis increase with this new front, which is going to obviously take cobbled divisions or brigades from other areas, making it very easy for the Russians to roll over the Ukrainians in other regions like the Donetsk region, the Zaporozhye region. And we're even hearing talk now of another front on top of the Kharkiv front that's likely to be opening soon at the Sumy, which is the northern part of Ukraine, northwest part of Ukraine, which could be opened at any moment because the Russians have just enormous reserves. So I wanted to talk about real quickly just the military situation for a moment here. I have discussed this at length. I have said that any attempt on the part of a conventional battlefield situation devoid of air power is pretty much committing national suicide as a country. And this is why when the war first started, I felt that Ukraine's best opportunity was when they had pushed the Russians back. They should have sued for peace or tried to enter into a peace agreement. Whether or not the Russians would have been motivated to do so is another subject altogether. But the longer this thing went on, the worse it got. I also believe that the counteroffensive that took place in Ukraine in 2023 was the death knell of the Ukrainian army, because those losses from some of their best troops, best armor, could not be replaced. And again, I liken that situation very similar to what happened to the Germans in World War II in their failed attack on Moscow in 1941, where they could never replicate those best soldiers ever again. They were gone. And what happened at Stalingrad was just another example on a massive scale, which it was titanic. But I think the important thing about Stalingrad that should be learned is that what the Russians did was they encircled that army and they basically chewed it down, ground it down to the point where there was nothing left outside of the people that came out of their hiding caves in the cellars of these burned out buildings to be taken prisoner. And what we're seeing right now is we're pretty much seeing on a very, very limited scale, because the economies of scale here are substantively less. But what we're seeing is we're seeing the Ukrainian army being ground down. And I think it's important for people to understand that economies of scale do matter. And Ukraine, their army is completely being decimated by Russian assaults all over the front. And the casualty count is now a matter of simple math. The math is that Ukraine cannot continue to replace men that they're losing, that are dead and wounded. They can't replace that with new people. And even if they did, they'd have to find time to train those people. It's been said that the United States training facilities don't see Ukrainians coming in for training as much. which obviously is a function of not having enough manpower. And I said this before, that the Ukrainians were going to get slaughtered on the battlefield because of the fact that their defensive tactics were seriously lacking. So let's get into that real quickly. What we're seeing in this war or conflict is we're seeing a degradation of Ukrainian armor. Just about every day we're getting videos of HIMARS, howitzers, tanks, fighting vehicles, rocket launchers completely getting smashed. And this is daily. And we're talking about what amounts to, since the beginning of this war, about $150 billion have gone up in smoke. None of that none of that investment has worked out. Not to mention the lives that it's cost the Ukrainian military, of dead and injured, 600,000 plus. And now we're finding out that the money that the West has been funneling to Ukraine is basically being siphoned off into bank accounts in foreign countries that are being held by Ukrainian elites that were supposed to build proper defenses, fortifications. All that money is being used to go into people's pockets. And you're seeing that playing out, not just in the Kharkiv direction, but you're seeing that played out just about everywhere. The Ukrainians failed to build proper fortifications. They failed to create large enough minefields to slow down the Russian armor. They failed to do a lot of things that, even from a defensive situation, they could have done to slow things down. And the reason why I'm saying this is because the only thing that's really keeping Ukraine together right now is the fact that they do have a robust FPV drone situation, but the amount of drones compared to the Russian drones are not even close. But at the end of the day, this is not a viable situation anymore. Russian Air Force jets are using Fab 1500s, Fab 500s, and now they've just developed the Fab 3000 bomb, where even if you build the fortifications, they turn the whole thing into dust. So I'm not even entirely certain that that would have helped. But the fact of the matter is that there's absolutely no way that Ukraine has a chance, a hope in hell of actually winning this war. And what they're doing is they're prolonging the agony on their own people. I sort of consider this a genocide perpetrated by the government on its own people. I think this is a Ukrainian genocide perpetrated by the leaders of Ukraine on their own people, because the leaders of Ukraine aren't willing to make the same sacrifices that their people are making or being forced to make through these ridiculous draconian laws, where they're passing these bills forcing people to fight in a war that they clearly don't want to be a part of. Now, does any army really think, does a military really think that forcing conscription on your citizens when they don't want to fight is going to actually make your army fit for combat with better soldiers? No, those people are cannon fodder, or they'll be the first to surrender when they see action. This is a completely ridiculous situation, and it reminds me a lot of the last days of Nazi Germany. It reminds me of what the Germans did when they cobbled old men, young children, and forced them to fight. And those people were basically slaughtered by the Russians when the Russians ended up taking Berlin in 1945. It's not that much different, because what you're seeing is a complete degradation of Ukrainian society. I mean, I find that this is genocide, as I've said before, this is a genocide being perpetrated by the West on the Ukrainian people through the Ukrainian elites. I mean, let's think about this for a moment. I just want to make this point. You've got a mayor sitting in Kiev. His name is Klitschko, well-known boxer back in the day, whose own children live in Germany. They can't be, they're not going to be drafted. The Germans aren't sending people back to Ukraine. These are people that left the war. They escaped it. And if you think that Klitschko is the only person who isn't about to sacrifice his own children, there are thousands of elites in Kiev that aren't ever going to participate in this war on the front lines, but are willing to put other people's lives on the line because those people are expendable. And what you're seeing in Ukraine is, I consider this genocide now, because there's absolutely no way that they can win this. So let's just look at this from a tactical, military, not a social perspective here for a moment. In every war, there's about a handful of things that make for victory. So let's just talk about this. I believe Daniel Davis, a well-known commentator and a well-known content creator on YouTube, mentioned this on his channel, and he should know because he's a decorated military veteran in the United States. There's some things you just cannot forget when you're fighting in a real conventional war. So let's just talk about that. One is you need manpower. You need reserves. You have to know what you're going to need over time. The second thing you're going to need is you're going to need to know how you're going to resupply your lines, whether or not the supply lines are going to be harrowed, meaning that are those supply lines likely to come into contact at the point of contact with real issues of loss. The third thing is industry. And I think this cannot be forgotten. Does one side have the ability to outproduce the other side? Meaning that in terms of pure armaments and weaponry, does one side have a major advantage over the other side? And then the next thing is air power. And air power and superiority in the air at the end of the day is one of the reasons why in World War II, the Allies were able to win against the Germans in Western Europe. So let's just talk about that real briefly. I don't want to get into a long, protracted discussion of World War II, but when you look at the differences of how World War II was fought on the Eastern Front from the Western Front, it's a remarkable difference. On the Eastern Front, you had colossal battles where you had tank battles at Kursk, you had artillery duels where you had 2, 3, 4, 5,000 artillery systems on the battlefield at any given moment in time. We were talking about fierce artillery duels. And artillery was the main killer at the end of the day outside of weather of the German armed forces, the German Wehrmacht in World War II. So in the Western side, however, we didn't have large concentrations of tank battles. We didn't have the large concentrations where you had Stalingrad until the Battle of the Bulge. And even then, that was a very limited conflict when you compare it in the scope of what happened on the Eastern Front. Again, the Germans only had a certain amount of divisions that they had in the Western Front. And even with the limited amount of divisions that they had on the Western Front, their tankers were much better. And I hate to say this, but it's a fact. Their tank divisions were more feared, were more professional, and their armaments were better than the Western armaments. So, for example, if you compared the German Tiger tanks, Panther tanks, to the American Shermans, it was not even a close situation. In order for the Americans to have done well, you needed 20 Shermans to knock out 1 or 2 Tiger tanks. The Germans, however, could not produce the Tiger tanks once they were knocked out in mass quantities. Now, How did the war in the West go? Well, what the Americans and British had, particularly the Americans, was they had complete air superiority. Majority of the German tanks were knocked out from the air. And there was a well-known battle, and I think for people that are World War II aficionados, you might remember a battle called the Battle of the Fillet Gap. And that was a pocket where the Germans were trying to get out and retreat and withdraw because they simply didn't have the manpower anymore to be able to deal with the number of soldiers, material, and men that were coming in from the United States, Britain, and Canada at the time. So they chose this specific route, and what ended up happening was American air power primarily pounded that pocket, and the amount of German armor and dead was astronomical. And this is important because air power at the end of the day was what allowed the Allies to win in Western Europe. Air power was what allowed the Americans to survive the Battle of the Bulge and eventually come out victorious. In fact, for a lot of people that may not be aware of this, the Germans were winning at the Battle of the Bulge, and the Americans were waiting for the weather to clear so that their bombers would have a better sight of the points of contact that they needed to get to in order to be able to eliminate the German tanks on the battlefield. So, again, I cannot underestimate the power of air superiority. And what we're seeing being played out in Ukraine is complete, total mastery of the sky. And there's absolutely no way that any armor can succeed against 200, 300, 400 kilogram bombs. There's no way that any armor can hide in tree lines, thinking that they are impenetrable or not vulnerable to attack from Lancet drones, from artillery strikes, or from direct bombings from Sukhoi jets, or the Ka alligators, for example, that are employed very similar to what the Americans used in the Afghanistan war with their helicopters as well. So there's absolutely no way. I mean, the Americans, through Denmark, they've sent over or will be sending over these token F-16 jets. I mean, for anyone who thinks that this is a Wunderwaffe or a wonder weapon, you've got to be crazy to think that. These are jets that are basically third generation in the context that they're no longer have value. They'll be shot down extremely quickly. And to make matters even worse, 16 of them doesn't mean anything when you're looking at the context of this battlefield. And I think this is important in the context of these ATACMS missiles that the United States sent over to Ukraine. They've been virtually useless to the extent that they've not been able to hit targets. They've not been able to change the battlefield at all. And again, it doesn't matter how many missiles you have. If you don't have the manpower and you do not have air superiority and you don't have the ability to replace it quickly, it's absolutely impossible to see victory at the light of at the end of the tunnel. You just can't see it. There's absolutely no light at the end of the tunnel for Ukraine. Now, there's something else that I wanted to talk about real briefly, and I don't think it gets a lot of attention in the context of military matters and military strategy. And I'm going to talk about this when it comes to professional military officers. It's very clear to me that the Ukrainian officer corps and officer staff is completely clueless and devoid, with exception of maybe 3 or 4, of people that have the ability to actually define properly strategy and the ability to be able to be innovative in this regard with less forces. So in Ukraine, there is no Rommel. Okay, there's absolutely no Rommel in Ukraine. They don't have an individual that you can say understands the battlefield as well as the Russian commanders right now do. And the Russian commanders have fought this war tactically as well as you could possibly have fought it since their 2022 debacle. And I think this is a function of them becoming more experienced, more professional, and more aware of what their objectives are. Okay? So objectives do matter. So what is the objective of opening up the front in Kharkiv? Well, I'm going to tell you what I think it is. I believe the Russians do intend to capture Kharkiv, but I do think that the capture of that city is more than likely to come from a different direction than where the Kharkiv assault is taking place at present. And I think this is a point that people aren't really looking at. Excuse me. If you look at where the Russians are in relation to where Kharkiv is, there are Russian soldiers not far from Kharkiv as we speak on the eastern side, and that have just stood there waiting. There is also Russians coming in from, obviously, the north, but they haven't come in with force. This concept that the Russians are rolling in with 100,000 or 50,000 men, that's insane. The numbers are more like 5 to 10,000 because they're coming in teams of maybe 20 or 30 at a time. Excuse me. And, this notion of defenses and minefields, they're just strolled in. There's videos of Russian soldiers strolling in. So what does that tell you? It tells you that the Ukrainians were prepared that there was likely to be an offensive, but the powers that be didn't care about the average Ukrainian soldier to be able to defend it because they weren't interested in putting the money into fortifications, into minefields. If everyone remembers when the Ukrainian offensive started, what eliminated their ability to actually conquer large tracts of land? What eliminated their capability? Well, what eliminated it was a minefield the size of Florida. And all we have to do is take a look at the photos, the videos of burned out U.S., British, Western tanks sitting on the battlefield where they couldn't move because they've been knocked out by mines or knocked out by air superiority or air power in general. There was absolutely no way that thing was going to work. And what it did was it allowed for the Russians to basically create a situation where they could do what they're doing today. The Russian doctrine has always been about encirclement, and it's always been about destruction and decimation. So they're in it for the long run. They're not in it for the short run. And their whole idea of winning combat in a conventional way is to force their opponent to destroy themselves by the decisions that they make. And this is clearly obvious. The Western leaders, the Western military establishment are devoid of people with any brains whatsoever. There are no Churchills, there are no MacArthurs, there are no Eisenhowers in the West who understand what victory is supposed to look like and understand that you cannot win without air power. I want people to stop and think that is huge for a moment. So if you're going to go out and fight a war and you don't have air power to support your troops on the ground, how do you expect to protect your soldiers? I would like to know, how do you plan to protect your artillery? How do you protect your armor? The Germans tried to do that, and they were wholly unsuccessful during World War II against the Allies in Western Europe. You cannot win a war if you do not have air power. So the mere fact that the West was never going to introduce air power into this conflict was an admission that they knew that Ukraine could never win. So from a military perspective, this whole thing was genocidal from the very start. From the very start. Now, as it directly relates to production, let's just talk about that for a moment. And I don't think this has been talked at length, but I firmly believe that the United States specifically is on the decay. And what makes me believe that they're on the decay? I'll tell you what it is. $60 billion in military spending in the United States simply doesn't get you what it used to get you a long time ago. It just doesn't. And when you can have a congressman hold up a bag of bolts that costs $90,000, what does that tell you about what it costs to deliver a Bradley that's worth $10 million or a fighting vehicle that's worth half that? I mean, I want people to stop and think that the Russian military-industrial complex, with $60 billion, they're building 1,000 tanks a year. I mean, it just doesn't get you the same thing. So the corruption, graft, and just about anything you can think of that's rampant within the U.S. military-industrial complex is essentially putting American national security at risk. And I think this is going to come home to roost when the United States finds itself directly involved in a conventional situation. And I'm going to be totally frank when I say this. It's not looking good for the collective West. I mean, the amount of money that's being sent over to Ukraine is not going to resurrect the dead. You can give $1 billion, $10 billion, $20 billion. It doesn't matter. You cannot resurrect soldiers you do not have. You cannot, absolutely cannot replace the lack of air power. Now, the West is not going to deploy air forces over what is essentially a no-fly zone because they know that the Russians will likely not only eliminate their air forces, but nuke the decision-making centers that sent them. They know that. So this is a war that could have been easily avoided. And it's also a complete underestimation of the Russian military-industrial complex and their ability to pivot. I mean, what the West has essentially done over the last year and a half is they have created a monster. The Russian armed forces is now a monster. A country that only spent $86 billion in defense spending prior to the war, which was 1/10 what the United States spends in defense, is now spending closer to $300 to $400 billion and getting much more out of it than the Americans could ever hope to get out of it because of the fact that the American military-industrial complex is driven by profit. It's not driven by patriotism. I want to make that point perfectly clear. The American military-industrial complex is driven by profit. So when the Pentagon tenders contracts to the industrial complex, the military-industrial complex, to Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, these companies will gouge the Pentagon and gouge the American taxpayer because they can, in the name of national security. And everything becomes much more expensive. And $60 billion, I'm going to tell you guys something. The United States will have a $1 trillion budget for the defense industry very soon, and it won't get them as much as what 1/10 of that would have gotten them 40 years ago. In contrast, what you're seeing in the Russian military industrial complex is you're seeing a major shift in how the Russian government treats the military industrial complex. So let me give you an example of what I'm saying. Recently, the Russian defense minister, the previous one, Sergei Shoigu, was removed from that post and promoted to another post that deals directly with procurement. He's actually now a director in the Security Council of Russia, which is the equivalent of the NSA in the United States. And he's dealing directly with procurement, meaning that he's not, he's working with the different companies in Russia to make sure that the military has what it needs. Additionally, a lot of the previous military officers are being purged out of the Russian military that were accepting bribes from companies, right? We're just talking about that, accepting bribes, on the way to creating a situation where the soldiers on the ground have confidence not only in upper management, but confidence in the company's patriotism. This is a patriotic endeavor on the part of the entire Russian populace, meaning that they're not going to tolerate corruption, graft. They're going to make sure that they build things where these companies are doing it out of patriotism. They're making money at the same time because they're building more of things that they never needed in peacetime. So we're talking about building more tanks, building more drones, building more Sukhoi jets, more advanced carriers. I mean, now the Russians are going to be building the largest super carrier in the world. This is likely to create a Russian Navy that never existed as well. It's likely to create a Russian missile gap when it comes to nuclear weapons and hypersonic weapons. So all of this didn't need to happen. And it's also driven Russia into China's arms, turning the entire eastern half of the continent, eastern hemisphere, into what I like to call a Russian-Chinese sphere of interest. When you take Russia and China, add all the countries adjacent to their borders, and then you add some of the countries in the east that are compliant to them, what you've basically done is you've created a situation where you've got larger populations, now larger economies, and you've got a purpose where the governments are purposed to never change, meaning that they're completely laser focused on the success of developing their military infrastructures. This did not need to happen the way that it did. And it's just a complete lack of understanding of how the Russian government works, how the military works. And I think what we're seeing here is we're seeing a specific situation where they're basically like a rubber band creating a problem on the battlefield for Ukraine. Ukrainians don't have the manpower. They're cobbling divisions to go fight Russians who are simply eliminating the weapons that they've just received daily and killing men on an industrial scale for this kind of conflict. I mean, we're talking industrial scale. Industrial scale. I mean, we're talking about 1,500 men a day. I mean, I want people to understand those numbers in the context of, sons, fathers, brothers, even some mothers if there are women on the front lines. The fact that Ukraine is now calling for, drafting women, it just says a lot. I mean, Zelensky is a purebred liar. Here's a man who said that the Ukrainian military only lost 31,000 men. And you have to ask yourself, if they only lost 31,000 men, why should there be a crisis? Why do you have to worry about, why do you need to mobilize people and force people into mobilization? It's because he's a bold-faced liar, and the people that he surrounds himself with are cronies of his that are stealing from the people, stealing from the country. Ukraine is the most corrupt country in all of Europe, the most singular corrupt country in all of Europe. And here we've got a situation where those people at the top of the food chain are committing genocide against their own people. I mean, this is absolute insanity on the part of the West and its leaders that they somehow think that it's possible to win this war. And I'm going to tell you what the outcome is likely to be. You're going to see many of these leaders replaced. Olaf Scholz will be replaced. Biden will be replaced. Macron is likely to be replaced. You're going to start to see people humbling themselves, okay, or going to the polls when their economies crumble, okay, and a different brand of leader is going to get elected. Because Europe is just not in a position to call any shots. They are not formidable as it directly relates to Russia. I mean, I want people to stop and think the Russians do not have any of their supply lines harrowed. They have an enormous ability to build and build and build. Just ask the German army of World War II, which was infinitely better than the Ukrainian army of today. You ask the German Wehrmacht, Heinz Guderian, Erich von Manstein, you ask any of the German generals of World War II who were infinitely better than this crop of Ukrainian morons, whether or not the invasion of Russia made sense at that particular moment in time. There was no way that anyone was going to defeat the Russians, knowing fully well that the Russians had enormous capabilities to actually go in and produce and produce and produce, despite losing 27 million people. Now, the losses that the Russians have had in these last 3 years of war are very small in comparison to Ukrainian losses. I mean, several estimates are about 10-1. And while it's not good to look at losses in the context of numbers as opposed to people, the fact is that war at the end of the day is about math. And when you don't have the math on the battlefield, and when you don't have the math in the air, and when you don't have the math in the industries and armaments, you cannot win. And the people that are running governments in the West and running militaries in the West, or even some of these generals, armchair generals in the United States, and I can think of several, I believe General Hodges. I mean, I don't know what pipe of crack he's been smoking, but there's absolutely no way, no how. And I would ask this of him or anyone who thinks that they could defeat the Russians devoid of air power. Would you send American soldiers on the ground without F-35s there to support them? Because if you're not willing to do that, American soldiers would die in massive amounts, just like the Ukrainians are doing today. So let's not talk nonsense. Let's not talk stupidity. Okay? This is military genocide being committed on the Ukrainian people by their leaders. And it's a betrayal also of the money that they've received that was supposed to go for fortifications, that it's going into people's pockets. And people have to pay for this, one way or the other. And if I'm a normal Ukrainian voter, or if I'm a Western Ukrainian and I don't want to participate on the front or be cannon fodder, then they need to revolt against, they have to revolt against their own current government. It doesn't mean that they have to be pro-Russian. Okay? Doesn't mean that at all. It means that they need a change of leadership. There needs to be peace. They need to make peace, because if they do not, they will lose more than a generation. Thanks very much.